Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. Professional cyclists are phenomenal athletes who specialise in suffering. Big races like the Tour de France push them to the very limits of human endurance. What makes them do it? And in recent years, what has distinguished the clean riders from the cheats seduced by doping? Well, my guest is retired Olympic champion and world record breaker Chris Boardman. What does one of cycling's great innovators make of the sport today? Chris Boardman, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
I've just talked about how cyclists are phenomenal athletes, but would you say the most important attribute for the top cyclist is actually mental rather than physical?
Yeah, I've been talking about that today actually, and I think it is. It's a very arduous task. I mean, most sports are, but being able to deal with pressure. And in the case of cycling, you know, one of the, if not the only event in the world where a race can last for 3 weeks, and to be able to cope with being a favourite in those conditions and dealing with it day after day is quite remarkable. So it's as mental as it is physical, at least 50-50.
If you don't mind, I want to dig a little bit into your psyche. You've said interesting things in the past. You've said, I am fanatical, and to be honest, other riders may have been more mentally healthy than me.
Yeah, I mean, well, when I left school, I was quite low in self-esteem and self-confidence, and for a while, my self-esteem and self-worth was wrapped up in results, which is not a healthy way to be, until I met my coach, Peter Keane, who was fascinated by how you get better rather than being the best, and was fascinated by this problem of performance. And he wasn't really interested in what the result was, only how to close a gap between what he thought would happen and what actually happened. And that was a real godsend for me, because he got me interested with the performance and making something rather than just winning or losing.
And you therefore make that sound very positive, but as I said at the very beginning, people associate top-level cycling, particularly maybe the Tour de France, but other endurance events which you've taken part in, they associate it with so much pain and suffering. And do you have to have a mentality that, in a sense, embraces that?
Yeah, I mean, there's personal challenge, and people, they reach their limit, and that's the defining point, how much you can cope with day after day. And you tend to find, funnily enough, in the Tour de France, because it does last for 3 weeks, you're more or less with the same people when the race blows apart, say in the mountains. You're more or less with the same people every day, because it's found your limit. And that might be as much as mental, how much you can cope, how much suffering you can cope with, as it is physical.
Graham Obery, who is a Scottish rider who for a while was a great rival of yours in British cycling, he said to me that he actually didn't think a truly happy person could be a great cyclist, because the happy person would be too tempted to sort of kick back and relax, and you can never do that. Do you relate to that? Do you think actually there was an element of you that was depressive?
I'm not sure about depressive, but certainly fanatical. I mean, it's not a logical thing to do. If you actually looked at it and what it entailed, then it's painful, and it involves so much sacrifice, and you can't do other things, and it's so intense and specialised. A sane person wouldn't necessarily do this. It does attract extreme people by its very nature, what it is.
Is it true that after your wedding, you persuaded your new wife to get up at 5:30 and go to some sort of hill race that you were involved in?
Part of writing a book, it is a cathartic process, and you go back, and there was chunks of it from, say, the early 90s when I don't recognise me, and I look back and think, God, was I? So yes, we got up at 6 o'clock the next morning to go and ride a tiny race in Lancashire, because it was the only time a race would be on that course before the national championships, and it was that important.
At what point did she say to you, you know what, I made a terrible mistake? Can I take yesterday back?
Well, funnily enough, it did get to that point. I mean, when we had our first daughter, Harriet, who got 6 kids, I took her to hospital, dropped her off, and then went back home to bed, and then phoned the hospital in the morning and said, what's the score? And they said, oh, it'll be a while yet. There'll be a while yet. So I drove to Hull, the other side of the country, to go and see a course for the national championships, which wasn't until the next day. I was the 4th person to know that I had a daughter. And I'm
listening to that story and I'm thinking, you were sick in the head.
Well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't necessary. It was, people would say, yeah, but that's part of what you had to be. Well, I think you could, if I didn't do that, if I'd stayed at the hospital, I probably would have still won the national title, but you can't unpick it. And I asked my father, actually, I said, why did you let me do that? And he said, well, what makes you think you were the only person who was obsessed? Yeah. So it can be all-encompassing.
Did success soften you in any way? Because, you know, if we go through, we can't chart every one of your career highlights, but obviously one of the ones that everybody will remember was '92 Barcelona, winning the Pursuit gold medal. Once you started getting that sort of worldwide acclaim, did it change things? Did you soften? Did that edge disappear?
I think it would, if anything, it went the other way for a while. It was like, how far can we take this? I mean, '92, I was an unemployed carpenter with a wife, 2 kids, and absolutely no money. And we didn't win. You know, the Brits turned up and made up the numbers, and that's what we did.
I think we hadn't won a gold medal for 72 years. Yeah.
So that proved that this was possible. So that we looked, what else could we do? And there was a world record attempt the next year, and then join a pro team, go to the Tour de France. So that was a deeply fanatical period, as it were.
But I want to pick away at this intensity, this fanaticism, because cycling is associated with that. And as you know, I think in many people's minds now, that element in cycling is now always associated with pushing beyond boundaries, going over the edge, and in particular, resorting to cheating and to doping. And given the mentality you've described that you had, how tempted were you?
I think you've described a mentality that's the same across sport, probably at the peak of every business, but specifically in sport, it's a very intense thing where intense people live. I think I was fortunate that I had something that I could do. It was quite small in winning short prologues, that I could come to a race fresh, and we understood aerodynamics from our Lotus days and could do something that had value. But at the time, you could tell that there were performances that are just not right. You know, people who you'd beaten the week before were suddenly climbing mountains, and you could see that this environment is not right, but only with hindsight do we look back and find out properly why that was. And it's taken cycling 20 years to get on top of that.
I'm puzzled why it was hindsight in a way, because you've always said that. But you know, we now know from the memoirs of, and they've been on my programme, people like Tyler Hamilton and David Miller, that
I worked with David,
Yeah, and I think Stuart O'Grady, who was,
he was on our team,
98, he was on your team. We now know he was cheating at the time too, and he was your teammate.
Yeah.
So when you tell me,
you
know, it's all hindsight, I'm wondering, were your eyes closed? Were your ears closed?
No, what we saw was the result. We saw the outcome. We saw, and I can remember riding with Stuart actually up a mountain in a race called the Midi Libre, and we went past a Jan Ulrich puffing and chuffing, and it was Stuart who said, if he's going well a month from now, that's just going to scar me, because Stuart was Australian, and he was. I think that was the year he won the Tour. So we saw that, but nobody discusses how you got there. So you see crazy stuff.
I think the tragic Italian rider, Marco Pantani, he had a lot of issues with drugs. He was a brilliant rider, mountain climber. He ended up dead, overdose of cocaine by 2003, a deeply unhappy, troubled man. But he said at one point in his career, he said, entering the world of professional cycling was like joining the mafia. Was there some sort of code of silence that you perhaps were part of? Well,
it's the same as with the press. When I've worked on the other side of the fence and we've watched cycling, both internally and when I retired, and you see performances, and we saw the Armstrong era where, oh, it looks like he could get a really challenge this year, and then suddenly they just ride away in the mountains. But in the press, what could we say, working on the race and covering it? That's ridiculous, that can't happen, you can't do that, that's libelous. So you can see something, only when somebody brings evidence later can you put all the pieces together.
But my point is, you weren't a journalist then, you were still a rider. You rode alongside Armstrong in some of his Tour victories. You know, we now know how systemic it was, and I just come back to this question.
We now know how systemic it was.
But it was systemic at the time, and you were inside. I wasn't, you know, all of us outsiders were just looking in thinking that is just remarkable. But you were inside the system. I think it had a bearing
on my own career in that I thought, well, why can't I win the Tour de France? Why can't I climb mountains? And people just rode away, and then you just have to deal with what you find.
Were you, that's a really interesting vision I've got, because you you were brilliant at the prologues and the time trials, but obviously mountain climbing was definitely not your thing. When you were in a peloton, a pack of cyclists, and the guys at the front just surge forward with such immense power and leave you, as you put it, chuffing and puffing, are you angry? Are you resentful? Are you thinking those guys are cheats?
I think you live through a period at the time when you think, I've just got to deal with what it is. These are the circumstances I'm presented with. And as I said at the start, I was very lucky to have one thing that had a value, to be able to win the short time trials that was useful there. And even that wasn't possible by the end of the 90s. And it just got to the point where I'm not enjoying it. And you mentioned my wife. And in the late 90s, well, 98, she said, right, I've had enough now, because I was miserable and we were making all of these sacrifices. And it's a big factor, health as well, of why my career was short.
One thing that always strikes me talking to athletes or professional sportsmen in a world which has been tainted by drugs is the degree to which you feel perhaps cheated, that nobody on the outside can ever be quite sure that any of the participants in that era were absolutely clean. I mean, you know, do you feel that there's some sort of cloud of suspicion over some of your...
That will reflect on me. There's nothing I can do about that. It's sad that I can't do anything about that. But I don't spend a lot of time looking backwards because that's how you just get bitter and twisted. And you have to live your life. I did something that I enjoyed, and then it was a period of my life, and then I did something else. So I think looking backwards, I only tend to look back as it pertains to what am I going to do next? Is there something to learn? So I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Only writing a book has actually caused me to go back and write some stuff down.
I guess my last thought on this is whether you ever were faced with an active choice. Were you ever offered drugs? Well, did any team say to you, you know what, other guys are doing it?
I think the Stuart O'Grady revelation was a surprise because our team, I think, was conspicuous by the fact that we just couldn't do anything in GC races and we couldn't get caught. I remember my boss, Roger Leger, probably around about 94-ish, 95, who got us together after a classic after the Flesh Will Own Classic in the team car and said, right, I can see that's really wrong here and it's going to hit the fan. And it might take weeks, it might take months. In the end, it took years. But I don't want any of you near that when it does, which was a pretty powerful thing for someone to say whose livelihood depends on results.
You know what Dick Pound, the former head of the World Anti-Doping Agency, said to me the other day? He said, I cannot watch cycling anymore because it is so tainted. It's going to
take a long time, I think, for confidence to recover. I mean, we've got, we're 20 years on now, and cycling is, in my opinion, probably one of, if not the cleanest sport in the world now. But because it was uncovered and they put a lot of processes in place, and now you have a culture where it wouldn't be tolerated from within as well as without.
Even though a lot of the people who work in this area of performance-enhancing drugs, like Julian Savulescu at Oxford, who does a lot of work on this, he says, and this is a quote from him, it's really only the dumb dopers who get caught. And he's talking about all of the different sophisticated masking agents and timings and phasings of taking different compounds that can mask this stuff.
Well, what I see now when I work in television and I watch the racing is it looks believable to me. Right. It looks like what we're seeing is believable. And last year, because everybody's still very raw, Chris Froome did fantastically well on the first Mountains Day. And there was the French TV said, oh, this is not possible.
He has faced so many questions.
But by that, and he's released his test results, and I mean, the old, you can't prove a negative. But by the end of the race, they looked anything but superhuman, and the entire race came down to less than a minute. So by the end of the race, I think it looked extremely human, and that's what we need, I think, for several years of calm for cycling to recover that.
What we've talked about in this interview is the degree to which, you know, and you say it's true of many top-level sports, but it's certainly true of cycling, that there is this constant ambition to push the envelope and to do things that take you to the very edge, both personally, in terms of physical endurance, but also actually in terms of what you can do with the machine that you're riding. And you have always been an innovator, a guy who's kind of obsessed with developing the perfect riding machine?
Well, just like making things. I mean, to go from wood or a personal performance or writing, so I just love making things. And I had an opportunity when I had a few years out and I wrote for a diving magazine and various other publications, gap years I suppose, before I was sucked back into British cycling. And I had a coffee with Dave Brailsford after the 2004 games. And he said, well, we're doing well, the coaching's going well and the athletes are really coming on now, but what about all the other stuff? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, there's helmets and there's clothing and there's bikes and there's wheels, there's all that stuff. Why don't you go away and see what you can do, whatever you like, see what you can find out and see if you can make people faster. And it was a unique opportunity that possibly no one else has ever had, to go and explore, not have to have any commercially viable product at the end, just had to make people go faster.
The thing is, though, you have a track record in that, because it takes us back to '92, the gold medal. I think it was the Lotus Sport bike that you rode that was new at the time. It was revolutionary, and you developed a special helmet, and you were very keen on your riding suit and all that sort of stuff. You were pushing the envelope then, but in '96, when you conquered this amazing world record, the 1 hour distance, you bust it completely. You went 56 kilometres in 1 hour.
Well, that was largely down to one individual, Graham O'Brien, who you mentioned, who was the first real innovator. He was the person who stopped talking and thinking about the history and started talking about the demands of the events. And he very simply went, well, if it's all about aerodynamics, if 90% of my energy is pushing air out the way, if I get rid of these two tubes, I'm going to go faster. And he was... so
he changed the riding position.
He was seen as a laughing stock at the time.
But I guess what I'm getting to is that when you did that in '96 and smashed the record, the governing body of world cycling, the UCI, immediately said, well, that's not acceptable.
Well,
you know, you're pushing the limits too far. You're making it a sport that's dominated by technicians rather than athletes, and they essentially changed the rules and undermined your record by saying it wasn't really legitimate.
But rules always change. I mean, it happens in Formula One. They had supercars and then they had too many accidents and the cars were going so fast that they said, right, we're going to stop and change the rules, and everything went back for a long period of time, and then slowly it's caught back up, and that happens everywhere.
But did you feel cheated in a way? Because that 1 hour, it's a bit like the 4-minute mile.
Rules change. It's things happen. That was the day, and these were the rules. And we broke the record with those rules. It's a bit like you were saying about a period of drugs. Don't spend any time thinking about it, in that I did the thing with the rules of that day, and then the rules were changed. It's out of my hands. And to an extent, I agreed with them. You know, it'd become human-powered vehicle racing, and they got caught out with the Lotus era. And then Graham came along with different position, and they said, you can't do that. And he said, OK, I'll do this then. Incredible. And it had been moving away from cycling, and they were struggling to keep up and try and work out, how do we keep this as the sport of cycling? And it was after '96 they went, right, OK.
It's funny you say I agree with that in a way, because you're one of the innovators who's pushed it away from pure cycling.
They give you a set of rules, and then you butt up against the edge. Right. And that's your job as an athlete, as a coach, you butt up against the edge. But if they move the goalpost, then you move back.
Is there mechanical doping today?
There has been. It is quite technically possible.
To put a little battery and a motor in a racing bike?
Yeah, as soon as you said you can have electric gears on a bike, then you've opened the way, you've allowed there to be electrics and wiring inside a frame. I would be absolutely gobsmacked if it happened in mainstream cycling. There was one bike found at a cyclocross race. I think you can find an exception to any rule. It's a fantastic story.
So when I watch the Tour de France this summer, I can be 100% sure that there are no batteries helping those blokes pedal.
Well, I can't be a person who can ratify that for you one way or the other, but I would be gobsmacked. I would be absolutely gobsmacked. And the bikes are checked. I mean, very, very quick check. Over the bike, they scanned for electrics. They can tell very, very quickly, and they've even been using X-ray machines on the Tour de France. So I would be. I mean, it is the anti-advert for any team. I'd be amazed.
There's one
good story though. I'd like to make one.
Well, because you are somewhat obsessed with developing the perfect bike, have you tried putting little motors?
No, but that piece of equipment called the Gruber Assist has been available for nearly 15 years. And it's quite possible to take a stack of batteries and put them inside a bike. And if ever I made an e-bike, that's what I would want it to look like, a bike that you can't tell that it's just not a normal bike. That'd be good fun.
One other area where it seems to me there's a real interesting discussion about how far you go in terms of pushing yourself and your sport is in the coaching. and this has become very relevant in the last few months because Britain's top cycling coach, the technical director of British Cycling, he eventually had to resign, a guy called Shane Sutton. There were allegations from one particular female cyclist who'd been on the elite programme that he had used sexist bullying language towards her. There were other allegations involving some of the para-cycling team, again about bullying and derogatory comments. He's denied it all, said absolutely no way was I sexist. He just says, you know, I have a forceful manner and that's the way I coach. How far can you go in coaching?
I think every workplace you've got to know where the line is. Shane was very, I think Australian has been the term. He's very, very forthright, blunt. Did he cross the line? Probably did over the years, did Shane. But now that the inquiry's put in place and they're going to look into that and we'll see what the outcome is.
It's serious, isn't it? I mean, you responded fairly quickly by saying you felt it was a bit of a lynching, but I mean, he's alleged to have said things.
And I was quite annoyed by that because it made it look like my comments were the British cycling was the lynch mob. Actually, what we saw was a trial by press for a week, and we didn't see things in context. And we saw one person held responsible for anything, a variety of different issues around British cycling.
But I mean, if a coach, a male coach, says to a top female athlete, "Oh, go and have a baby," I mean that as she alleges, I mean that is not acceptable, is it?
Well, if that was the case, then it wouldn't be acceptable. If that is, I mean, that's why we're having an inquiry. But and I'm certainly not standing here in defence of Shane. I've not no position to be either way. I want to see what happens with an inquiry. But I know that if you had a conversation and just said, well, it's not going to go forward, it's been really good, maybe you want to think away and think about, you can go and have a family, do whatever you want now. Well, you could take that and say, he told me to go and have a baby. It sounds very different. So I'm aware that in this job that we do, you can take things out of context very readily, as the headlines were with me last week.
I guess it comes back to where we started, which is about the mentality of the cyclist, because we're talking about a team, the British cycling team, and they've got their own problems at the moment. But in the end, it's a massively individual sport, isn't it? When you're on that bike on a long ride,
the end result is, but to get to that end result, it isn't. It is a team sport, and we have to remember that lottery funding is for winning gold medals, and that might change, but when it was set up, it was to win gold medals. It wasn't even a medal, not world championships, not developer sport, to win gold medals. And I think the term compassionately ruthless was there. And so when I was involved, it was exactly that. You're not making the grade. We're going to do everything we can to help you make the grade. If you don't make the grade, you're gone.
And that's a phrase I've not heard before, compassionately ruthless. I mean, when you reflect on your career in cycling and reflect on the stories we've discussed about some of the individuals that you've ridden alongside, from Lance Armstrong to Marco Pantani to many others, is there a part of you that wonders whether cycling, of all elite sports, is perhaps in some ways a deeply unhealthy sport?
I don't think cycling's any different to any other sport. I think we're seeing that with others, particularly athletics at the moment. I think it was ahead of the game. French customs started the ball rolling back in '98 when they pulled over vehicles and found products. And cycling has benefited from that. It's taken 20 years, but I think it was because of those circumstances ahead of the game. And I think all other sports are having to go through the same thing now. I
mean, you said you've got 6 kids, and I wonder if any of them are showing any interest in, or whether you would encourage them to go into top-level cycling.
I've always said the kids can do whatever they want to do. I've got one that's really into his cycling, the rest are normal, and they can do whatever they want, and we'll support them in it. But I'm not wedded to cycling. I'm not wedded to sport. I enjoy watching a sporting event, and then I also quite happy to go and ride my bike to explore and go and do the gardening.
Chris Boardman, it's a nice way to end, a nice thought to finish with. Thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you.